So now we are going to start to hear directly from our colleagues who were involved in the different operations, or sorry, the different meetings at the field level. And our first meeting today will be moderated by Sue Hodgson. Sue, I know you're on the call with us, so happy to have you with us today. I think you're someone who needs little introduction, but I will say a short bio so that everyone is aware of who you are. Sue began her career with the British Army, where she served for 22 years before transitioning over to the humanitarian sector. She has worked for a variety of organizations, but since 2017 has been with Save the Children and is currently the lead of the humanitarian supply chain. Some of you might also know Sue because she sits on the strategic advisory group of the logistics cluster. And when asked her for how long, she made a funny joke. But the reality is for the last 4 terms. So Sue has been with the strategic advisory group for 4 terms. So Sue, I now hand over to you and for you to introduce the other panelists that will be speaking today. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Yes, my funny joke was when she asked how long I've been in it with the logs cluster, I said since just after the dinosaurs roamed the earth. But anyway, good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody, depending on if you're listening in live or whether you're going to listen to this later on the recording. So today, the facilitators panel, and we have a number of great panelists to open the discussion on this. But we will be looking at a discussion focusing on Kenya, South Sudan, and Ethiopia. As we all know, these areas are regional hubs and also country offices in humanitarian need. And looking at how we face these challenges relating to conflict, displacement, and natural disasters. So as part of the panel, I have today to introduce Francis Kakeri, and I apologize for names, Pani Rose Bussy, and a colleague, Natalie Emery from the Logs Cluster. So first of all, let me introduce Francis. Francis is a dedicated professional with extensive experience in supply chain across management and the logistics itself within the humanitarian and the private sectors, and has worked in Namibia, Armenia, Eswatini, Ethiopia, Iraq, Myanmar, South Sudan, and the Gambia. And Francis is currently the Deputy Logistics Cluster Coordinator in Ethiopia. Our second panelist is Pony. She is an accomplished leader with 13 years experience in procurement and supply chain management within the sector. She has experience being demonstrated through her work with international NGOs, including Save the Children, yay, Samaritan's Purse, Sia Fund, and Serenity, I think it's pronounced. But she provided senior level strategic direction at both national and global levels. She's a member of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, and is currently the president of the Cheveners for Change Association, which is co-founded by Women in Logistics. I apologize, Pony, for the poor pronunciation on some of those areas. And our final panelist is Natalie Emery. Natalie has been in the sector with experience in development as well as humanitarian for over 16 years. And her work in the logistics, she's worked in the logistics cluster in South Sudan, and she is now the projects and outreach officer in the logistics cluster team based in Rome. So welcome to all the panelists. And there they all are, so everybody can see our lovely faces smiling. So to get this started then, we've held successful meetings in South Sudan, Ethiopia, where there was 22 participants, and in Kenya we had 28 participants. And I've got a couple of questions just to get the conversation started. And the first questions will be based on looking at funding and humanitarian access, which have continued to be top priority in many of our discussions across the cluster and across agencies. So I'm going to first start with Natalie and look at Kenya. While you're in Kenya, you're looking at using advocacy to address the two challenges of funding and humanitarian access, including customs importation. So could you share maybe some specific examples of how the partners discussed using advocacy to address the challenges, and perhaps any concrete outcomes or actions that the meeting came up with? Natalie.
Thank you, Sue. And it's great to start with the most difficult question, it seems. Great to be here and great to see everyone here. In Kenya, we were generously hosted by ICRC, and we had a great meeting, as you mentioned, with 28 participants. The discussion on funding was, of course, a tough one. As was mentioned before, and as we all know, funding allocations have been recently significantly reduced. This has led to wide-scale reduction or even closing of some programs and has affected most of us here in humanitarian sector. In our meeting, we discussed and we agreed that there is an urgent need to advocate for funding, but that it should be for evidence-based programming, that it should build on our expertise, on local knowledge, on interoperability, and an integrated approach. We agreed that we should advocate for work that highlights the effectiveness of joint programming and joint approaches, and that our advocacy messages for funding should really reflect collaboration among the different organizations and even showcase the successes from the past collaborations. Under humanitarian access, we also discussed this as a critical need, something that we really need to advocate for as a collective. We looked at advocating for the protection of humanitarian workers, but also the need for facilitation of movement, like providing visas for humanitarians in a timely manner. We discussed advocating for information on customs processes and any other information that could cause potential bottlenecks, and that this information should be provided in advance before an emergency. We looked at different ways to then amplify these messages, right? We were trying to find, okay, how can we amplify? How can we advocate? So we said we need to engage with key stakeholders, number one. And to do that, we need to build strategic partnerships. We looked at developing advocacy materials that can use interagency documentation, use impact stories to really share the message and help others understand why this is so important. Of course, we will leverage media and public platforms, social media, web pages, and so forth. But one thing I thought that was interesting that came out of the discussion was also an action of engaging in high-level meetings and events. So this could include organizing a roundtable discussion in the region with the right people, the right key stakeholders. So for example, with the National Disaster Management Offices or with the customs agencies, together with the humanitarian partners, to then discuss practical steps and agreements. So these were some of the actions that we took. I'll hand over to you, Sue.
Thanks very much, Natalie. And feeding on to that, I'd like to come on to Pony next. And there were similar discussions, as we know, held in South Sudan around the same subject. So perhaps you could also give us some examples of what came out of that meeting and what agreements were reached from the South Sudan meeting. Pony, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me in this meeting. Indeed, in our meeting, we discussed a lot, and funding and access came out as the major challenges in South Sudan. South Sudan currently is facing significant funding challenges, and overall, the humanitarian needs continue to increase. However, the funding has gone down by more than half in the last first or second years. Despite that, if we look into the logistics and operation support costs, it's significant low, despite the fact that South Sudan is classified as one of the challenging country to operate. And of course, this is due to the poor infrastructures in the country, the continuous conflict in the country, and also road access like flooding that affects delivery or increases the cost of delivery of program needs. So what we agreed as a logistic cluster community in South Sudan was to form a working group that will unpack more of these funding challenges, and more especially to find messages that we can use for the advocacy to the different donor communities in South Sudan, but also at the global level. The focus is indeed to increase funding, especially for the humanitarian needs in South Sudan, given that the needs continue to increase. Example could be South Sudan now hosting refugees from Sudan, and of course that increases already the challenges that the country is facing. A group will work together to coordinate approaches that can be used to ensure that the donors are well informed with clear data that will help them to make informed decisions and ensure that the financial support in South Sudan is made consistent if possible. However, the first step that we're going to take as a logistic cluster community in South Sudan is to invite one of the key donors to come and speak to the logistic cluster community. And the purpose is not to start advocating right away, but is to ensure that this key donor, for example, the USAID, would speak to the logistic cluster community to clarify or to give us a clear understanding of the funding landscape and also the donor approaches as of now, particularly to handle areas around how logistic or operational cost can be incorporated into project proposals. Given the limited funding to the logistic cluster, we also feel it's very necessary that donors should know that partners should be able to be funded for costs like transportation, for example, road or river transportation, for example, rather than completely trying to rely on logistic cluster, yet their mandate is limited and they may not be able to support all our logistic needs in South Sudan. Around access, as mentioned, this is also one of the key challenge that is experienced in South Sudan. For example, detention of assets like vehicles after closure of a project in a given location complicate the efforts to deploy these resources in another location that may be having high needs. Yeah, additionally, bureaucratic delays in obtaining clearance, as mentioned earlier, was also mentioned as one of the key challenges that is affecting delivery of services to the needy people, and more so increasing the cost of delivering the services to the needy. We still came up with actions in terms of how to advocate for this, and the logistic cluster community agreed to further map these embedments, not just to rely so that we can break them down into exactly what these amendments are to the humanitarian operation. And this working group will further be tasked to map specific clearance procedures. For example, what are the procedures, what are the clear timelines, and ensure that the outcome from that report is shared with the entire logistic cluster community in South Sudan so that people know, and we know this is the standard process, for example, in getting some of this clearance. Additionally, collaborating with the NGO Forum and OCHA will also further strengthen the logistic cluster initiatives of advocating for unified efforts to address the challenges around access in South Sudan. In conclusion, strong and continuous advocacy by the Logistic Cluster Committee, not just the Logistic Cluster, is crucial to engage donors and the government and to ensure that humanitarian access in South Sudan are in place or improve. Thank you so much. That's briefly what I can say. Back to you.
Thanks, Pani. It sounds like it was a really productive meeting and some great actions came out of that, particularly as say around donor engagement. So great to hear that. And moving on, obviously, Francis, the same question, but looking at different environments slightly within Ethiopia. So perhaps we could hear from you on how your meeting went with the Ethiopian team and what they came up with to look at advocacy and access issues. Francis, over to you.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you for all the previous speakers for setting the scene and giving us guidance. In Ethiopia, we had fruitful discussions with several partners. As mentioned by Natalie and Pony, funding was a key challenge experienced by most partners. At the moment, the humanitarian needs in Ethiopia are 18% funded, and this is out of the HRP planning exercise. So it's a severe constraint. Most partners agreed that we'll continue to rely on the traditional partnerships with the donors, but we have to apply some tweaks to it in the sense that food and non-food items have been there's been a disparity between the two. Some of you who have been following Ethiopia will know that there was a food pause, and one of the reasons was that non-food items was not equally funded to food items. So a case can be made for that based on the evidence, and that's one thing we want to articulate and say we would like to have an equitable distribution of funding for both food and non-food items to mitigate or minimize the impacts of these challenges. But on a positive note, we also noticed that there are things that we can do slightly differently. We can engage with the private sector, and that's one area of prioritization. But we can also go, and I'll bring in REC here, we can do a bit of the circular economy. I'll just give you a statistic. Between May and August this year, the WFP operation has got about $122,000 from some recycling ventures that they've been doing. So WFP operates a fleet of, say, 500 trucks in Ethiopia. So there's a supplier that will take the trucks, old batteries, old tires, and recycle these into other products. So it's not a conventional way of getting money, but it was one of the options that came up as a way we can raise funding unconventionally. Of course, we are looking at crowdfunding and other innovative digital options to reduce the reliance on traditional funding sources. So there's a lot that came out of these discussions, and we set up a working group to follow up, especially on these actions, and see how we can incorporate more of the non-traditional funding methods into resource mobilization for the partners operating in Ethiopia. It was noted that the crisis in Ethiopia or crises in Ethiopia are not getting as much publicity as they need to because of several other competing events going on in Ukraine, in Gaza. So we need to shout louder. We need to be smarter about the way we present what we need. And that came out strongly in the discussions. Regarding access, access has been a severe challenge. We've had a couple of fatalities, commandeering of commercial trucks, and it has become increasingly difficult to operate in certain parts of the country. Fortunately for the logistics cluster in Ethiopia, we have a strong partnership with the WFP fleet, and we have been able to support partners that want to move into these regions. But I mean, there's no commercial transporter willing to risk his assets or his staff. And this has been one of the ways we have worked around it. We really want to commend the WFP fleet for giving us a lot of support in this regard. We will continue to engage with both actors. It's a challenge in the sense that the contextual difference between what is happening in Tigray and in Amhara region, we can go into detail later, but it's a complete set of protocols for access. So we found that the most effective delivery method is to use the WFP fleet trucks, especially where commercial transporters completely do not want to risk or are reluctant. And in some cases, the fees that they charge the partners are prohibitive. So that's where we were at the moment, and I'm open to any questions or clarifications. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. Yeah, it seems a lot of the points made here are very similar issues that are coming across in a different variety of areas. You know, regional, Kenya is very much a regional hub as well as a country hub, and two very different operating environments between Sudan and South Sudan, Ethiopia, but similar issues around ability to fund and gain access. So as we've talked previously in earlier in the meeting here, that there was areas of preparedness we wanted to look at. So I'm going to first of all come to Kenya and Ethiopia to look at that point of preparedness, as this came out in both Kenya as a regional perspective, but in Ethiopia as a country perspective. So if we just start first of all, Natalie, with yourself, because you're at the Kenya meeting, we discussed the discussion centered around strengthening regional supply chain to support field operations more effectively. But could you share why preparedness is especially critical for this region, and what specific actions or outcomes merged from the discussions about regional preparedness? And perhaps that could also link into the little bit about access, because obviously having regional base is great, but we need to get it out of the regional base. Yeah, over to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Sue. And yes, in our discussion, we had quite a good conversation about regional preparedness. I think we all agreed that it's a very important aspect to cover. Important because, first of all, it will enable a shorter time response. It will avoid any duplication of effort, and it will really increase the ability of local actors to respond if following this preparedness approach that we've used in other locations. We did anticipate a few challenges when looking at this, right? There's different regulatory environment in different countries. There's different procedures. There's a lack of funding, as was mentioned earlier from colleagues in the chat. There's a lack of funding for preparedness. And there's also need for a lot more improved information sharing among humanitarian actors cross-border, not only within a country. So these are quite a few challenges that need to be overcome. But however, there was also another challenge that came up where colleagues said, well, we're also many different organizations. We've got different procedures, different regulations. But in the end, we discussed that this actually could be an asset where every organization can bring their strengths to the table. And we saw that in the meeting where through the discussion, different organizations said, well, we do this, and then we do this. And we were able to share that kind of information and see where we can help each other, where we can share information, where we can share different meetings or different resources together to increase preparedness. So overall, we really agreed that preparedness in humanitarian logistics is important and needed in the region. We discussed the potential of a working group to kickstart this process, because as we discussed, we realized there's a lot to be done on this front, and we would need some sort of working group and someone responsible for supporting this. But we also discussed that without funding for it, specifically allocated to preparedness, it wouldn't be something feasible that could be done. Should there be budget allocated for this? We looked at some actions or some steps that we could take. We agreed that we need to map stakeholders and resources across the region, who is doing what where. We also agreed that we need to share best practices. There are organizations, there are different locations that have implemented a preparedness approach successfully. So they could share some of their best practices, some of their success stories, also their lessons learned. We were looking at working with existing mechanisms to achieve low-hanging fruit. As I mentioned in the discussion, for example, we had IOM who was discussing some of their preparedness initiatives. ICRC has some preparedness initiatives. So coming together to share what we are already doing in the region and how we can share that information or capitalize on that. Of course, we talked about once we agree on what needs to be done, we need to secure and support and resources. And we also discussed specifically in this region is that we need to decide which countries are included in this region as different organizations. For East Africa includes different countries and different organizations. Coming back to access, as we mentioned, under access, without having this information ahead of time, without knowing who's doing what, where the resources are, we wouldn't be able to have access and be able to implement our work as effectively and efficiently as possible. So it is all tied in together, as you mentioned, Sue. So back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it just highlights the point of being of cross-organizational support with each other, working less siloed. And, you know, at the end of the day, we all share the same issues. We're not all doing different things. We're all doing the same things. And I think also to think about the advocacy piece we talked about before, that's if we work together, that gives us a stronger advocacy argument if we work together. Strength in numbers, as they say. And it gives us a nice segue, Francis, into a discussion on collaboration. So in the Ethiopia meeting, it was highlighted the importance of logistics preparedness and government support. So we're adding in another layer here of collaboration. So perhaps if you could elaborate on particularly why those areas were prioritized, and perhaps some of the discussions or suggestions came up as to how we could strengthen that collaboration.
Thank you, Sue. And I think what you mentioned about not operating in silos is where I'll start, because in Ethiopia, the logistics cluster, for example, is co-led by Ethiopian Disaster Risk Management Commission, and Ethiopia is signatory to a couple of UN frameworks like the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Paris Climate Change, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. But it's also party to continental frameworks through the African Union. The challenge is, how do we move from having the frameworks to operationalizing them? I think Natalie touched a good point when she said, how do you budget? How do you plan for it? There's a reluctance for funding of medium to long-term resilience initiatives. We have to find a clever way to do that. But I think overall, the engagement with government from the beginning, from the start, is important. We have worked with the government in Ethiopia during the landslide emergency, during the conflicts in the country. And that seems to be the best approach because it embeds systems, it embeds processes that even as humanitarians, we know that if we pull out tomorrow, there's a sustainability that has been achieved in building the resilience within the country. The suggestion from the meeting was we develop plans together, we do it through a working group, and have all the government actors actively involved. So if we want to get customs exemption for importation of urgent humanitarian supplies, do we need to have Ministry of Finance on board from the get-go? Do we need to have the Ethiopian Disaster Risk Management Commission? So there's a joint sense of ownership that will make progress much easier in that regard. There's also a challenge of funding, and in this regard, there was a suggestion that for the partners that are focused on medium to long-term resilience building, like the African Union in Ethiopia, we could approach these particular agencies to help us transition from what has been an emergency operation into a more sustainable, longer-term resilience featuring initiative. So that was a summary of many of the discussions, because almost everyone had a plan, but very few had the budget to support or to execute the plan. Thank you.
Thank you. It's funny, all the conversations we're having, the latter part of these conversations always comes back down to where do we find the funding to do it? But yeah, interesting. And Francis, just touching on there, you mentioned there working with the governments and collaboration strengthens and provides strength, capacity, sustainability. So, Pani, I'm going to come over to you on this one. And I know as part of the South Sudan discussions, there was an area highlighted that we needed to look at increased capacity building, capacity strengthening, and that was clearly emphasised across the meeting. So could you just highlight, following on from Francis's point there around strengthening and sustainability, and give us an insight as to why you think this is important, or why the group thought it was important, and maybe some examples of where we've had successes, perhaps in around doing exactly the capacity strengthening we need. Pony.
Thank you. So once again, in South Sudan, and indeed as we have seen across different countries, increased capacity building is crucial to strengthen the local capacity in very many countries, and especially in South Sudan, I would say with the national NGOs, empowering the logistic cluster community to ensure that there's sustainability in the operation. Given the conflict and the challenging context of South Sudan, marked by the limited infrastructures, continuous or recurrent conflict, the high level of illiteracy in the country. In general, it's ranked to be 70% of the population as illiterate, or if you take the youth rate, it's less than 50% of the youths are educated or literate. Significant humanitarian needs as well. Therefore, capacity building is indeed essential or very important to ensure that the local capacity is made or it's developed to be more resilient and to be able to operate and meet the needs independently. Furthermore, capacity building also support the localization goal, which is helping, for example, South Sudanese organizations and community or individuals to be empowered in case of a shift from the international lead to a locally lead logistic operation. So yeah, those are really the key reasons or importance of having capacity building. In terms of the strategies in South Sudan, in our face-to-face meeting, we did agree to have a working group that will unpack some of these training needs. What are these specific training types that we need? Determine feasible ways of how these trainings can be administered to the different logistic cluster community, and identify also existing capacities within the logistic cluster community. As we said, we do not want to duplicate. We know that resources are limited, and therefore we need to use what we have to get what we really need. So we had our first meeting after our face-to-face global logistic meeting in country, mainly with the working group, and we agreed that it would be better to have a survey done that targets all the general logistic cluster community. And the purpose, as I mentioned earlier, is to identify these critical training needs and also map the internal capacities from the different partners, so that if there's a partner already that is running, for example, procurement training, we can leverage from that. And therefore, some of the proposed strategies were to leverage on some of the online and face-to-face trainings opportunities that are provided by the logistic cluster. If we go to the logistic cluster website, you'll be able to see some of these trainings like warehouse training, basic logistic humanitarian training, maybe how to install the MSUs. These trainings are available, so why can't community or the logistic cluster community leverage on some of these training? Additionally, the the NGO Forum intensive program used to be there, but it was closed because of funding. The good news is that it is reopening to allow or take in more interns that can be developed, and they have a capacity already of about 100 interns that they will be able to take and support. Of course, the purpose is still to develop the new graduates to join the community and be able to do work, which is part of the capacity building.
Yeah. Sorry, Penny, just for time, I'm just going to have to end there, if that's okay, because we are getting to the end of the session. But there's some really good points there. And the point of training and sharing training, there's a lot of training out there, not reinventing it. And let's work together to see what we can do to build that capacity. But before we do finish, I just have one final question for all the panelists, and a very quick question is if you wanted people here to take one thing away from each of your sessions, what would it be? And Pony, as you're on there at the moment, let's come to you first. What would your one takeaway be?
The main one would be working together really as a community, because if we are divided, we won't achieve more. But if we work together as united logistic cluster community, we can leverage on the capacity we have as a community to try solve the challenges that we're facing. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pony. Francis, what would be the one thing you'd like people to take away?
I think I'll echo what Pony said. In our case, I was utterly baffled by one of our health partners and the wealth of knowledge that they had. And I realized how uneducated I was in that sector. So I think we can share and learn a lot from each other, especially when it comes to processes and objectives and outcomes. So collaboration.
Absolutely, Francis. And Natalie, what would your one thing be? Are we going to have a full house here, or?
I am laughing because it was exactly what, when I was reflecting on our meeting, and as Francis said, some of our partners, when we were discussing our different challenges, some of the partners came together and they're like, well, I have something happening here and I'm working on this. And right away, we had a whole group talking about specifically about stockpiling, but there was the majority of the meeting, they were talking about different solutions together. And just there, in a couple of hours, we already found that some colleagues had solutions to some of the challenges from other partners. So really the value of coming together to address common needs and challenges was my takeaway.
Great, thanks so much. So that does bring this discussion to a close. So I'd just like to thank the panelists, Francis, Natalie and Pony, for their inputs. It sounds like some amazing meetings went on in those different areas and some great inputs. And it'd be great, you know, like, let's take this forward, work together, and as I said before, strengthen numbers. But thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day and some interesting discussions. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Sue, for moderating that panel, and to Francis, Natalie, and Pony Rose. Some interesting engagement there, and I'm going to do my best not to speak because there was many topics related to training that, of course, I want to respond to. Before we transition to the next session here, just to show that these were some of the photos that were taken by the meetings that happened. So here's the group in Ethiopia, and here's the group in Kenya. I don't think we have a photo from South Sudan.